All right. Looks like we are recording. We are going to go back to our lecture. All right, this week we are talking about the presidency and the executive branch. So in your textbook, that's going to be both. Back at me, I want to share my screen. We are going to, no, I can't, now it doesn't look like you see my screen. Let's go back to sharing screen. This week we're going to be talking about the presidency and the executive branch. You will have in the textbook, we'll have two chapters to cover, chapter 12 and 15. So that's covering the presidency and the bureaucracy. We're only going to be covering one aspect of the bureaucracy in this lecture here. So really just focus on that for, and that's the civil service system for the exam. All right, let's get right into it. So this is an overview of what we'll be talking about today. I'm talking a little bit about the origins. So this is Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution that covers the executive branch, those powers that it gives both the powers of the limited powers that the Constitution give the presidency or the executive branch, and really the evolved powers that have become a part of the presidency. How a president takes office, those we've just seen an inauguration and a peaceful, somewhat peaceful transfer of power. Those important cabinet, how they decide who are those key advisors and the other leaders of the executive branch and the bureaucracy, and how they appoint those folks, how they go about governing, and a little bit about the bureaucracy in the civil service. Here are learning objectives for this week. All right, so the presidency is covered, as we said, in Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. It really came about as as we've mentioned multiple times, in the Constitutional Convention when they came to initially amend the Articles of Confederation, and then decided to create a whole new plan. When they were still in that phase of amending the Articles of Confederation, what was put forward was a New Jersey plan from the delegates of that had come from the state or the Confederated State of New Jersey. That basically said, one of the main problems with the Articles of Confederation was that there wasn't a robust executive branch. So let's just add that executive branch and give the federal government a little more power to be able to do the things that we need the federal government to do, things like foreign policy and currency exchange and having a single monetary system and the like. And then at the same time, you have Alexander Hamilton there proposing to have a single executive, though he advocated for this person to be appointed for life, which was not a very popular opinion at the time. But he also said that this single executive should be chosen by state electors, so elites that are chosen from the state, because he did not, as some of those founding fathers, did not trust the public to be choosing such a high office as a chief executive. And we see that part of this made it into the final Constitution as the Electoral College. The debate that really happened when they did decide to amend, or not to just amend the Articles of Confederation, but to create a whole new constitution. There's not a whole lot of detail about the presidency. They really knew that this office would evolve over time, but the real debate focused on two primary issues: is how would they help balance the power between the legislative branch, executive branch, and the courts. And how would we keep this executive power, which in its nature, the executive power would be very powerful, and how do we have accountability for those individuals? So what became a compromise plan ended up being Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, where we have an executive branch that's equal to, independent on the legislative branch to the Congress, We have three equal, we say often, three equal branches of government in the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. That there would be an executive officer, one person that oversaw this executive agencies. Now, in the Constitution, in the Constitutional Convention, they did not see the president, which would be later named. It was just in the Constitution. It says that there will be an executive officer. They did not envision that office to be what it is today. The current presidency, as we'll talk a lot throughout this lecture and throughout the week, is much more powerful and has a lot more power vested in the presidency itself than the founders ever would have expected, and that's happened over time. This president would have 4-year terms. So in between, you have a House of Representatives that is really close to people with 2-year terms. You have the U.S. Senate, the other branch of, or the other house of the legislative branch, having 6-year terms. So there's the longevity, and then the presidency being right in between there. And then they created this thing called the Electoral College, which again, this executive would not be elected by the people as the House of Representatives at the time were, or the state legislatures as the Senate was at the time as the Constitution was originally written, but by electors. So the legislatures in each state would choose individuals that would elites in the state that would be the ones that actually choose the president. And this has, again, turned into what we now know as the Electoral College. The states choose those electors, and the electors, and based on popular vote, which is now what happens, there's a popular vote, the electors choose the president based on that popular vote, but there's still this middleman step of the Electoral College. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about elections later in the semester. Let's talk a little bit about the very first president, because it was an incredibly important role that George Washington played as the first president. Most importantly, because they did not outline a whole lot of what the responsibilities of the president of the United States was in the Constitution. They weren't quite sure how this chief executive would work. They had limits on the amount of power and influence that they could have because they didn't want it to be a monarch. They wanted it to turn over a decent amount, and they wanted the states to have some say in who that person was. So it was pretty vague. This was the term president was a new term that George Washington ended up, agreeing to because they didn't want it to sound, king-like. They didn't want to sound, too high and mighty, but they wanted it to be fairly simple. This is a chief executive, and they came up with this new term, the president. And again, the Constitution is not very specific about what the president is actually doing. So what the actual president does. So George Washington, everything that he did set a precedent. And we still look back to some of the things that George Washington did, and now say that those things are enshrined in not law, but this is how things should work because George Washington did it in the first, and those precedents have carried all the way to this day. And this has obviously evolved over time. These precedents have been broken, but there's two real powers that the president has that we want to dive deeper into, and those are formal powers and informal powers. So some of the things that Washington did many of these, but you'll see also on the slide where I've highlighted the president that kind of made a new precedent and established some of these new powers, because none of these are really laid out. Actually, none of these are laid out in the Constitution. So some of those formal powers first one that came from George Washington was establishing a cabinet. So the Constitution says that the president can have formal advisors. And what that has turned into is the president's cabinet, the president's formal advisors and the heads of the executive bureaucratic departments. So George Washington was the first one. We'll talk about some of those first cabinet officers later on. Another one that came from Washington was the Neutrality Proclamation. So it clearly sets out in the Constitution that Congress has the authority to go to war. So the Congress has to declare war. It says that in the Constitution and is not disputed, even though that obviously doesn't always happen now. The Congress hasn't declared war formally since World War II. So obviously, again, this is a part of the evolving presidency. The president has sent the U.S. Armed Forces to war and in effect sent our country into war, but Congress has given up that power to the presidency. But it doesn't say anything about the opposite of war, of claiming neutrality. So President George Washington, in his term, made a precedent saying that the president can do the opposite of declaring war and can declare neutrality, which ultimately ties the hands of Congress, but George Washington did it, and it stuck. So he claimed neutrality in the war between England and France right after the United States became a country, thought that we shouldn't be entangling ourselves, and saw himself as the head. One of the things that it does say in the Constitution that the president does is foreign policy. So he said that he had the authority to claim, to say that the United States was going to be neutral in that conflict, and that has stuck. And you'll see many other examples here. Again, other formal powers. I'm not going to go through every single one, but slavery. Think of the Emancipation Proclamation from Lincoln. There was much debate whether he had the authority to free the slaves in the southern states, and he did not believe that he had the authority to free slaves in the southern states that still had slavery, but that had not left the Union. So Maryland and Kentucky still had slaves, but they had not left the Union yet. So Lincoln did not believe that he had the authority to free those slaves. But that act expanded the power of the presidency. FDR greatly expanded the power of the presidency by using executive orders during the New Deal and in the run-up to World War II. Some of the informal powers that a president have are some of the most important powers that a president actually yields. You often hear of a president's kitchen cabinet. So you have his cabinet, which are the formal heads of the executive departments. But most presidents also have a group of friends, have a group of informal advisors. And President Andrew Jackson, reporters gave the name of the kitchen cabinet to his close group of advisors because they didn't enter the front door like his formal department heads did. They came in through the kitchen door. They came in through the back door to give him advice. So they became known as the kitchen cabinet. One of the things that John Quincy Adams did as Secretary of State became known as the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe was the president. John Quincy Adams was the Secretary of State. But Monroe basically claimed that other powers should not be meddling in any Western Hemisphere issues. So anything to do with South America, they should basically stop, and the Caribbean and Central America, that Spain and Portugal and Great Britain should stop trying to have furthering their empires. That the United States was going to be the protectorate of this part of the globe, and they didn't know if they had that power at the time. So again, they kind of made this informal powers. He didn't sign a treaty. It wasn't a formal thing that he did. He basically just put the European powers on notice not to be meddling in American affairs. And then you often hear about the bully pulpit coming from Theodore Roosevelt, just using their sheer force of personality to get the public and members of Congress to do what they have. You have the largest what they call a pulpit when you're standing up, think of church pulpit. The pastor is the one that everyone's paying attention to. So the president has a unique power in that is anything the president says is going to be covered and people are going to pay attention to. So he could yield that power. So you want to think about, and when you think about presidential power, you have both formal powers and informal powers, many of which have evolved over time. So we're going to discuss a little bit about that taking of office. So there's been a presidential election, which happens every 4 years, and either and then now we have term limits on presidents, so they can only be in office for 2 4-year terms. So you either have a president that has been reelected, a president that has lost an election, and a new president coming in, or you have a president that was reelected. Or you have, a president was term limited, and you had two new people going up against each other, and one of them obviously won. So election day is now the first, has always been the first Tuesday of November. The election day is in the Constitution, has never changed. The inauguration day has actually changed. That is because the transition period was initially too long. Initially in the Constitution, it said that the new president would take over on March 4th of every 4 years. So there'd be a election in November, and then a inauguration in March. So that would be 6 months of this transition period, and it was decided that was really too long. So in the early 20th century, they moved it down to January 20th to shorten that transition period. It's also known as the lame duck period. If there's not a re-election, a president just taking on another term, because those are often the person's leaving office, and so in that lame duck, either Congress or lame duck term, there's a lot of interesting things that happen when someone knows that they're not coming back into that office. So one of the most important things that happens during this transition is that you have over 4,000 political appointees in 15 different cabinet departments that have to be staffed. So the president, as the head of the executive branch, he's both the leader of our country, but also the leader of the executive branch. So he's the one that staffs the senior most folks in the executive branch. So these are the 15 cabinet level appointees. So they're cabinet nominees, the heads of those departments, along with 4,000 other deputies and assistant secretaries and special assistants all throughout the government. So that starts as soon as the winner is made. I mean, really, it happens, and once you're down to the last month or so of a presidential campaign, they are thinking very hopefully and usually start this process of selecting some of those folks well ahead of the actual election, and then as soon as a winner is declared, that work goes in earnest. And then obviously the inauguration day itself is always now on the 20th of January, where the president actually takes the oath of office and hops right in and takes over that very day. So let's talk a little bit about that actual cabinet. The first precedent that George Washington created was in establishing that original cabinet of advisors. And what we call those first 4 positions that George Washington created are the inner cabinet. These are the most important of the cabinet positions. They've been there the longest and are still to this day, the most important of the cabinet departments. And those are the United States Treasury, the Department of Defense, originally was the Department of War under George Washington, the Department of Justice, led by the Attorney General, and the Department of State. So those are considered the inner cabinet positions. And then you have the outer, that says out cabinet, but outer cabinet positions below. Now, of those, we mentioned that there are 4,000 positions that the president can fill. This is roughly 4,000 positions the president can fill. About 1,000 of those must be confirmed by the United States Senate. So these are all of the cabinet secretaries, most of the deputy secretaries, deputy assistant secretaries, and many others in those departments. And basically everyone that's not all of the senior positions that are appointed by the president, excluding the ones that are actually in the White House. The folks that work directly for the president in the White House do not need to be confirmed by the Senate. So that process has to start pretty soon. So it's usually in December at some point, depending on how quickly a winner is declared, the Senate will start having those hearings to confirm, especially those first 15 cabinet secretaries, and then into the new year after a new inauguration. That work is going on right now. I think a large chunk of the cabinet secretaries have already been confirmed, and I know they're starting to work on deputy secretaries and going down. So it takes months for those for people to actually get into those jobs, during which they'll have some of the civil servants that we'll talk about later will be the acting secretaries until a new president's nominees can be put into office. And I mentioned some of the, you have, these are examples of the sub-cabinet positions. So you have the secretaries in each of those 15 cabinet level, and then there's other agencies that aren't considered cabinet level but are incredibly important. So you have the Office of Management and Budget, Central Intelligence Agency, EPA. Those are all incredibly important positions. But actually, no, some of those are considered part of the cabinet. I think environmental. Okay, maybe not. But those are, yeah, so they're sub-cabinet but incredibly important agencies. And then those ones that are within cabinet departments, you have the deputy secretaries, you have generals and admirals in Department of Defense, ambassadors over the State Department, and the like. So that first, for some reason, probably just because it's a nice even number, the first 100 days of a new president's time in office is always incredibly important. What are you going to accomplish in those first 100 days? President Biden is in the middle of that time right now, with obviously lots of things that they're trying to accomplish in that first period of time, because you really have to establish yourself in this new role. A couple of things that really make a difference on how those first 100 days are going to go and how fast or bold you're able to go are two things that need to be taken into consideration. One is, do you have an election mandate? A president will have an electoral mandate if they won by a very large margin. So it was kind of a blowout, which hasn't happened in the United States in quite some time, really. Reagan's first election was probably the last time that we really had a blowout where a president was coming into office with a strong mandate to lead. That the vast majority of the American people said, "This is our guy," so they can go into office knowing that they have the backing of the American people and can get right to work. As we know today, where there isn't, it was a close election. President Biden clearly won both by popular vote and the Electoral College, but it was really only by tens of thousands of votes in a handful of states. And the nation is still clearly divided. So no one can really say that President Biden won with any kind of clear mandate to do anything. There's still a lot of people that disagree and wanted another guy. The other important factor is what's happening in the congressional election. If a president wins, either with it doesn't always have to be the president winning with a wide margin and to bring in Congress. Sometimes the president can narrowly win, but get a large number of members of Congress elected in that same year. And they call that congressional coattails. So if the president wins and gets in office, and then a fairly large number of representatives or senators also win their election, it often is likely because of the popularity of the president or of their policies. So they say that those members of Congress came in on the president's coattails, were part of that push to get the president. And if that's the case, then the president has a number of members of Congress that can owe their getting elected to office to work the president did or the president's policies, so he can turn to them and count on them to help push forward his early agenda in those first 100 days. Some examples of this, some would say that 2008 was a fairly it wasn't a wide margin, but it was the largest of the really modern presidencies, since the Reagan one that was a real blowout. Obama had a comfortable margin, and that gave them the confidence to push forward with what some would believe is radical, but a dramatic change in our healthcare system called the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. Again, another example would be in 1964. after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, President Johnson, the then vice president who assumed the presidency, won by a very large margin. Mostly folks thinking that we needed to carry on the legacy of Kennedy and show strength. It was in the middle of the Cold War, so we needed to show that America was still strong and had trust in our leaders, even after Kennedy was assassinated. And Johnson used this mandate to push through civil rights, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in those early days of his first full term on his own. Some other examples of things that happen that presidents have to deal with in those first 100 days are foreign policy entanglements. If something either happens or and well, I guess this doesn't really count for 9/11 for Bush, wasn't within the first 100 days. It was within the first 200 days, maybe 250 days, but something that derailed his, what he was planning on doing, and he really had to focus on that. And then Vietnam for Nixon, when Nixon came into office, Vietnam was there was no ignoring that. He had to deal with Vietnam in those first 100 days. And then also economic situations can be something that presidents have to deal with in their first 100 days. When FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, came into office, that we were in the middle of the Great Depression. So we had to make bold moves in those first 100 days to address, and same with President Obama with the Great Recession. We had just had this housing collapse and economic fallout right before the election. So that was obviously going to be their top priority. So some of the other important parts of how a president governs. There's many aspects, but we just want to touch on three things that that presidents will use. One of them being directly tied to one of the informal powers. And I mean, these are all really informal powers as well. But the first being the bully pulpit. Theodore Roosevelt had a very strong personality, and also knew that if he took his legislative priorities out to the public and wanted to and let those members of Congress know that he would go to the public, that he would use his voice to get what he wanted passed through the Congress, that it would help. So he uses very effectively. You could also say that President Trump used this power very effectively. The Trump rally is something we hadn't really seen probably really since. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt didn't have huge stadiums to fill or anything like that, but we probably hadn't seen anything like that since Theodore Roosevelt, being able to bring people together in person to ask for their direct assistance, and using that power that you have as being atop of the federal government. The concept of going public is very important, because this is generally refers to the Oval Office address, when the president can make all of the news channels, large networks cover that when they say that they're going to have an Oval Office address, particularly during prime time. The networks and all the cable news channels know that this is going to be an important announcement, so they all cover it. And this is really, there's no one else in the United States that can say that I'm about to say something, and everyone will cut off all of their programming just to cover that. And they often use this to appeal directly to the American people. Instead of more with the bully pulpit, he's more the president would be more trying to move Congress and members of Congress, and trying to get them to do their what they think is best. But going public, using the president's voice to move the American people, and either to get them to call their members of Congress, or just to move public opinion, is really the most powerful tool of the presidency. The president's voice, speaking directly to the American people, is one of the most powerful, one of the most significant powers that the president has. Lastly, I want to touch on legacy. It's something that all presidents are going to be thinking about. This is an incredibly important position, and you make history just by getting there. And so all presidents want to do big things in some way that leaves a legacy for them. You know, to have some doctrine attached to their name, or have something that they're largely remembered for. So that's something that presidents are always thinking about when they're governing. What's going to be their legacy? Now we're going to talk a little bit about the bureaucracy. So when we talk about the executive branch, you know, the head of the executive branch is the president. That's going to be one of the most important parts of the executive branch. Obviously, it's the only part of the executive branch that's really talked about in any detail in the Constitution. But the executive branch is much larger than that. What the Constitution really says is that the president that heads this executive branch will carry out the orders and laws that Congress makes. So Congress says that we have to do something, we have to have a tax, we have to build roads. It's the executive branch that does all of that. So usually when people think of the government, when you say the government is doing something, it's usually the executive branch. And, you know, this consists of the 15 cabinet departments and many sub-cabinet agencies. The civil servants, all the people that work within them. The civil servants are all the people that work in the federal government, minus the political appointees that come in, that change every year. These are career folks, and we'll talk a little bit about how that whole system has changed over time. And then you have folks that are federal regulators, are the ones that are making sure that the government is doing what it's supposed to. Tax collectors, the people that are making sure that we are paying our taxes and the government is spending the money the way we are. And ultimately, again, the executive branch is what carries out the laws that Congress passes. That's the purpose of the executive branch. The first bureaucrats in the United States, you know, were really those first 4 cabinet members that George Washington picked to be his cabinet departments, his primary advisors. So these are the Secretary of War, Henry Knox, Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, the Attorney General, Edmund Randolph, and the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. And each of them had secretaries or had folks that worked for them. They had you know, medium-sized departments, you know, probably dozens of folks that worked for each of them in those first years, and now these have grown to many thousands, tens of thousands of employees in these large first departments. Interesting to know that the office of the presidency was very small initially. George Washington thought of his 4 advisors, or those are the folks that helped him do his work as the president. So there weren't any other staff. You know, there was household staff that worked that helped the president where he lived, but Washington in the White House, but Adams on. They had White House staff that helped with the running of the White House and having events and the like. But it was Lincoln was the first to have actual full-time secretaries to help him with his letters and correspondence. And then under FDR, that function of folks that are helping the president do their job full time had grown to the point that they had to formalize it, and they created the executive office of the presidency. So there's now hundreds of folks that work directly for the president, helping them do their day-to-day job, and that's a part of how the presidency has evolved over time. And we'll have some of your supplemental videos that are in the lessons folder. We'll talk a lot more about how the presidency has evolved to where it is today. Now, I want to touch a little bit on the civil service system. So this is all the folks below the cabinet agencies that are appointed by the president. This again had evolved over time because initially it was the president appointed all the folks that worked in the executive branch. Again, with George Washington, it was only 4 people, and then through Lincoln was, you know, probably a couple hundred or so, you know, in all the major departments. But now you get into the 1800s, where you have every time a president comes into office, there are thousands of people that are there looking for jobs. And these are often well-paying jobs, so there would be a large incentive to try to get one of these jobs. And this included all over the country, not just in Washington, D.C., but the common patronage jobs were the postmaster and the folks that controlled roads and bridges and trade were all incredibly important jobs that were appointed directly by the president. So it became very corrupt. And, so you'll hear both of this term political patronage is just how if you helped the president get into office, then you were given some political patronage, meaning that you were given some sort of job to thank you for the work you did to help get the president elected. And then over time, it became even more corrupt in that there were direct payments being had. The spoil system was eventually came into being in the 1850s into the 1880s and 90s, where you'd only be given a job if you put in your own money, and the people that controlled those jobs would be getting bribes back and forth. So it took some time, but there was an effort to try to end the spoil system and deal with political patronage, and so there was a push for civil service reform. 1883 was really the first big push in the Pendleton Act, which created what we now know as a merit-based civil service system. That if you want a job, in the IRS, you have to show that you know how to work with numbers and have done something similar in the past. If you want to work in the post office, you have to show that you have some skill and training, education to make you good for that job. And so that created our current system where most of our federal employees are picked based on their skills and education, not because they worked for a presidential office. So the vast majority of the federal employees are now under the civil service system, which was established under the Civil Service Commission, which really there still is a Civil Service Commission that works with the departments to create the individual jobs and categorize them. And then and now the Civil Service Commission evolved. What really is now it says predecessor, but is the successor of the Civil Service Commission is now known as the Office of Personnel Management, OPM. They classify all the jobs, recruits, and puts folks into those federal civil service positions. There's many pay scales throughout the federal government, but most of them are on the general services pay scale. So most federal employees fit in a job of either a GS1 to a GS15, fit into one of those categories based on seniority and the kind of work that they do. And then there's a top level of SESs, Senior Executive Services. So this includes the presidential appointees and some or many civil service folks that are not presidential appointees, but very senior in large departments, are part of the Senior Executive Service as opposed to general service. And there is my overview slide that is empty. I will fill that before I post it. But yeah, so we have covered the executive branch and the presidency. These lectures are supplemental to what you're reading in the chapters and the additional videos that we'll put up there. These are things that I want to be highlighting each week, and you should be using these PowerPoints that will be available as study guides for your exams coming up. And thanks for listening, and look forward to seeing you soon.